meeting of the District Plan Review Subcommittee. Welcome to any members of the public who are watching out there online. I have had some feedback of people appreciating being able to go back in their time and have a look as to the issues we're addressing. So do we have any apologies?
Yeah, I think one from Councillor Linwood, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Hopkins. The rest of us are present. Just by way of...
Sorry, I should have done
Sorry,
that.
yes, sorry. Yeah,
Apologies.
my apologies.
Sorry,
All right,
apologies
yes.
from Councillor Linwood.
I'm that efficient. We're rushing through here without following correct procedure. So we have it seconded by the Mayor. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Carried. Any declarations of interest by members of the committee today, subcommittee today? There are no declarations, Madam GA. Before I ask Mr. Campbell, our planning manager, to speak to today's agenda, I'm loath to comment on things I see on social media, but after last week's meeting, there were some discussions and named councillors who were involved in a voting process. They obviously hadn't listened to the briefing at the start of the meeting. This meeting is a meeting of the subcommittee, but per our standing rules, any other councillors can sit in and take part in the discussion. They do not take part in the voting process. So those councillors who were named as having voted, in fact, hadn't. So, and the process is that this subcommittee is voting on chapters in terms not to approve them, but to approve their passage to full council for approval. So, Mr. Campbell, with no further ado, 10 chapters, 2 hours, it's head down and we're into it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just a reminder of the process we've gone through to date and I'm going to go through. So as the Chair reminded us, we're recommending for approval the 10 chapters, and these have been through a kind of non-RMA consultative procedure last year, and we had over 320 people gave feedback, 3,000 odd feedback points. So what we've done is made those available to the public. They've been to this committee for consideration and a bit of a steer. No decisions made up until last week when we had the first round of meetings, and today we're just going through the zone provisions by and large. So again, these pick up the National Planning Standards new zones available. We currently do have zones at the moment that reflect a lot of these, but they just have different kind of names and terminology. So that's probably the big adjustment, is the new zone names as such. But by and large, we've tried to kind of replicate a lot of the provisions we already have that tend to work pretty well. But one such as large format retail zones, a new one that's available to us. So we've chosen to use that where we can. And likewise, any of those other new ones that we might not have had in the past, we've used as well. So it's a big adjustment for all of us in the community to sort of work out what these new zones mean, but by and large they try and reflect what we've already got, or pick up new ones where we can use them. A lot of the feedback around these was sort of some minor nature around sort of the thresholds and limits and what you can and can't do in each zone. So nothing too drastic, but it's just to try and get those thresholds right again. So a bit like we went through last week is what do the provisions mean, what might trigger consent, what might not, and just trying to get that happy medium for those. So again, as I said, we're following the National Planning Standards. This whole draft plan or moving to a proposed plan is prepared under the RMA, so we're following that national direction we're supposed to, and working through these again bear in mind that's the direction we've got to abide by the RMA, but importantly the national planning standards for these type of zones. And obviously the maps follow this as well, which you have seen they're on the draft plan at the moment, but not a lot of these ones will change from the draft to the proposed, but there might be some minor tweaking around the edge. So that's the overview. Any questions on that or the process going forward?
I just had a general question regarding, you know, the formation of the new government and the various changes that are set to be upon us in the first 100-day plan. And I just wondered if it would be appropriate to address any thoughts we might have around how this would impact the process overall, because obviously it's going to add a certain element of disruption or change in the direction that's required, at least, as opposed to what we choose as a community.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Blackler. Like you, we probably haven't had much time to digest the gory detail of what the agreements signal, but we know there's potentially some dialing back of some of the sort of biophysical limits that are set in national policy standards, that type of thing already. They've signalled that in the freshwater space, Indigenous biodiversity at least. And there's obviously a push for that kind of urban development. So how they achieve that will be up for debate. I guess one of the key things is our plan is still prepared under the RMA. We haven't looked at that sort of future NBA or Spatial Planning Act that's enacted, but is set to be repealed. So that doesn't actually have an impact on what we're doing or what we will do going forward. I guess until any of those changes are legislated, like the biodiversity or freshwater, then it's a bit of a second guess as to what it might look like. In terms of any of that sort of urban growth side of it, we've already got that signalled in our spatial plans. So I think we've kind of picked up that general theme anyway. If there's any changes, we can adjust them as we go through, either through a variation to the plan after it's notified, or later on a plan change itself if we had to readjust. So the system provides for that flexibility now. And the last year or so has been a lot of change that we've had to try and adjust to get into here. So I don't think it's a big hurdle for us, or shouldn't slow us down, or need to change course in any of this.
All right, thank you for that explanation. We'll move straight into the chapters, and the first one is the local centre zone. Invite any members that want to comment on the chapter as we have been reading them in the last week. Councillor Hopkins.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Question on page, I've got a couple of questions. I'll yield to you in terms of how you want them done, but on page 13 of our council agenda, of the committee agenda this morning, I'm just wondering if under LCZ 01, we shouldn't actually say, there is a reference in that very first line to "and thus suburban shopping centres in Oamaru." And I found myself thinking, well, I presume you mean the South Hill New World and the small cluster of shops around the junction there, and the other more substantial suburban shopping centre in the north end. But I mean, is it fair to say even if the southern one is a shopping area? So my question really is, should it be areas plural, and or should we say the southern and northern or something of that sort? Moving to page 15, and this applies to all the plans, all the chapters we're looking at today. I'm wondering if under the permitted activity status in all of them, we can't put at the bottom after, well, in this instance, we're looking at permitted activities 1 through 8, we can't put a link to the standards page in the chapter. Because if I'm a stranger using the district plan for the first time, I'm going to read those things and say, well, what is the maximum height? How do I find that out? So if we can put a link in just saying, go to this page to see what the height of those, so that's a suggestion to us. Page 20.
I'll just interrupt you, Councillor Hopkins, and I'll invite staff to reply a couple and then we'll come back to you.
That's fine, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's appreciated. Going to the last point about the standards, in the new E-plan format, which this will become part of, there'll be a hyperlink to those kind of things. So when you're on the E-plan, it'll click on that and take you to that provision. So that deals with that issue throughout the whole plan. Same with definitions. If something's defined, it will take you straight to that definition if you click on it. So that's an easy fix there. In terms of those areas, I mean, it's trying to pick up some of the smaller towns as well. So they have quite small areas like Otamatata, Kirri's got Vulnerova Main Street, Palmerston, that type of thing. So the South Hill, North End are kind of similar in that respect. So they can be quite small, but we're trying to say they've got sort of more than one shop. So South Hill has a BP, New World, Fish and Chips, Doctors, etc. So it's sort of more of a cluster that is almost self-sufficient for those local residents. So it's become a local centre for them. Doesn't mean it's got everything there, but it's a sort of a wee bit of a hub there. So we'll keep them plural, I think, in this case. And it's shown on the maps as well.
Thank you for that, Councillor Hopkins. Carry on.
Yeah, look, just to satisfy me as much as anything, on page 21 and elsewhere in these chapters under LCZS2, there's a reference to say LCZS2 number 1, third line, recession lines. And I just thought they've always been referred to as recession planes. So it's just really a question about the terminology. Looking to my last two on page 23, this is more fundamental, obviously. I have anxieties about this obsession we seem to have with setbacks from the road. And I notice on LCZS5, any building or structure may be set back no further than 5 metres. Well, if you look at a place like Palmerston or the front and Main Street there, that would ruin the character of that quite considerably. And arguably, even at the north end, a 5 metre setback would actually disrupt the kind of built fabric line of the buildings along the footpath. So I know it says may, but why have we chosen 5 metres? And to the extent that it isn't a stipulation, but an option, need it be there at all, or what authority or effect may it have? And is it actually desirable to encourage buildings to go back as far as 5 metres from the road in some of those smaller areas? And finally, on page 24, LCZS7, the verandas under 1B, the veranda is connected without any break to any existing veranda on an adjoining site. Now, if you look at Thames Street, the verandas are connected, but they're not continuous. So is it clear enough that the veranda doesn't have to be exactly the same as its neighbours, only that it has to touch it? Do you see what I mean? I'm just, it could read or could be interpreted to mean that you have to have the same veranda as your neighbour. But if you do look along Thames Street, that's not the case. So I'm just really posing a question as to the clarity of that particular provision. So those are my things on this chapter.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hopkins. On that last one, it's a particular one relating to Palmerston itself. So it's quite a specific rule, and so it's a very limited frontage in that respect. So these provisions won't apply to Thames Street. That's the
No.
yeah.
I was citing the Thames Street difference with it, and there are other references in other of the zones along the way here where verandas have to be connected. And again, it's just that same set of words as in B here. So it may be, if you feel a need for any clarification, if you feel I've raised a point that's valid, and you don't have to agree with me, but if you feel it's valid, it may need just a little bit of tweaking, that's all.
I guess on that one, it could be sort of a break of up to so many centimetres or whatever if we decide there's a sort of a building issue there. They don't have to necessarily join, but they might touch over a slight gap, which, yeah, may be possible.
Well, no, it's not that. Sorry, Mr. Chair, it's not that. I don't want to have an argument, but it's not that. It's the, are we requiring people to build a veranda identical to the one next door, or are we simply saying you have to touch the one next door? Now, the latter makes sense. The former may be an impulse too far. And all I'm asking is, does 1B make it clear enough that you don't have to have an identical veranda? That's all.
Yeah, so it's not saying it has to mirror or reflect the verandas on each side, so it's doesn't require that. Going back up to the other comments, there is session.
Yeah, if I may say that.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's been in there for a while, hasn't it, Rachel?
So through the chair, the 5 metre is the maximum that they can be set back, and it is a rollover from the operative plan.
Okay.
Yeah, and there are instances in the North End, such as the is it the Honda motorcycle shop, where there is parking in front or landscaping in front, and the building is not right to the street like you see in Thames Street.
Okay. So that's what we've got now. All right. That's fine. Other people can argue that. So other people can argue that in the submission process.
Yeah, it does provide that kind of different option for kind of display frontage for a vehicle or motorbike type shop scenario. The recession lines one is, I mean, it's just kind of a change in terminology, but it means the same thing.
I know.
It's, yeah, what people are used to, I suppose. Yeah. And it's generally called lines throughout, so.
Can I just make a comment in passing in terms of a number of these chapters today? I see there is provision for rainwater tanks, storage tanks of less than 5,000 litres are exempt from any of our calculations. I just wonder if we're actually being forward thinking enough in that, in terms of climate resilience, but also to strengthen our infrastructure. We shouldn't be encouraging people to have on-site water storage, saving that water going into our system, and allowing them a supply of water that, if for any reason council couldn't supply, that there's some self-sufficiency.
Yes, a good point, Councillor Thompson. The rule there is really only for a tank within a setback. So if you want to have a bigger tank, you can certainly do that. But you just have to be either get a deemed permitted boundary activity approval from the neighbour or site it further back. So most people try and put them close to the building. So if the building was close to the boundary, then it leaves limited room, but you still need room to be able to get around the building for firefighting and other provisions. But you put them underground, that type of thing. So it's really only saying this, reasonable sized tank up to 5,000 litres is exempt from the boundary setback. So if you wanted something bigger, you either shift it further away or underground, that type of thing.
Thank you for
So
that.
it doesn't negate it, it just sets a threshold.
Is anyone else want to speak to this chapter? Councillor Wackler.
I'd just endorse Councillor Thompson's comments regarding the stormwater capture or rainwater capture to buffer the impacts on the stormwater system. So anywhere right throughout these chapters that we see an opportunity for that, we should be grabbing it.
Mr. Chair, David's right and you're right, but what the plan doesn't say is you can have a bigger tank. Now, the question is, do we think we should add something that says, you know, bigger tanks larger than 5,000 metres are permitted or will be allowed, but may be subject to certain rules? I don't know. I'm not sure what the solution might be. But if you two are going to say, and I see the merit of the argument, that we want to kind of signal, hey, you'd be wise to have on-site water storage, then what David's saying is, yes, we're not stopping it, but people may read the setback provisions in relation to the 5,000 metre capacity as the limit on the tank.
Yes.
So we just need to find maybe a sentence that it signals that the setback doesn't dictate, doesn't prescribe larger tanks. It may simply affect their location, something like that.
Sorry, just while we're having this discussion, I'm kind of thinking maybe perhaps rather than prescriptions around storage, we should be focusing on the outflow into the system. So allowing people to come up with their own solutions. So it would reference back to kind of whatever benchmark and achieve neutrality against that standard.
That's hard to do.
It would enable the person developing the site to come up with a solution rather than us dictating what the solution is from an engineering perspective.
Through the chair, so that aspect will be dealt with through the stormwater chapter, which will come in a subsequent meeting. But around the potential message that you can't have something over 5,000 litres, we can definitely put an advice note in the standards to say that larger tanks are permitted, provided they meet the setbacks.
No, I think that would be really valuable. If there's no further discussion on this chapter, would someone like to move? Thank you, Councillor Hopkins. With the amendments as suggested. Seconded, Councillor Blackler. All those in favour? Aye. Carried. So we move on to the mixed use zone chapter. Sorry if I skipped one, have I? Sorry.
Mr. Chair, I have three questions on this chapter. Well, sorry, the subchapter, I think. Actually, it may well be it may be part of the first chapter that just voted. Under policies on page 29.
Well, the heading was the local centre zone, but then
yeah, visitor accommodation precinct, Omarama and Otamatata. So on page 29, the policy P1, there's a reference to where there are generous building setbacks and associated landscaping provided. And I'm just trying to work out exactly where that is and why we are in every instance sort of essentially insisting that it stays that way. So that's question number one. Page 31, I'm wondering under commercial activity R3, we've got permitted activities. Any commercial activity is limited to restaurants or the sale of food and beverages or souvenirs. I'm just wondering if we could add something like galleries or, I mean, it seems to me that there are other amenities that relate to specifically to visitors that might be prudent to permit, because otherwise people might have to jump through unnecessary hoops to get them. And on page 33, under standard number 1, where any on-site car parking adjoins the road boundary, a continuous landscaped strip is required with a minimum depth at 1.5 along the full road boundary, excluding access ways. Now, I'm just wondering, if we're going to allow people to park on the road rather than behind the building, surely the less distance from the road. I mean, what you're saying is you have 1.5, then the parking space. Why don't we just say where on-site car parking adjoins the road boundary, you know, a setback of 2.5 metre maximum. I mean, why are we landscaping it, then putting cars in there, then the building? It just seems to me to be a questionable use of space, and it tends to some extent to fly in the face of the logic of having on-site car parking adjoining the road boundary. So I would suggest we might want to revisit that.
Your response, Mr. Campbell?
Thank you, Councillor Hopkins. I guess the zone is kind of a continuation of what we have for Oamaru and Otamatata, and it generally picks up what is already there by and large, but there's still some sites that could utilise these provisions going forward. And it is quite a limited area in both towns, so other areas have the commercial for other activities. So what we tried to do is say, well, that's the kind of character of the accommodation in Oamaru and Otamatata. It's not built right to the road like you have in Queenstown. So it's trying to say, let's keep it that open kind of more spacious feel. They're generally quite big sites, largely with the accommodation in place or further back. And it's kind of trying to keep that wider, perhaps streetscape appearance. In terms of the parking, it's, some sites do have parking right on the roadside, but generally these are by the state highway. So the Otamatata Hotel, for instance, probably wouldn't meet that if it tried to build now, but it's already kind of got its parking established. So that's got existing use rights, whereas in Oamaru, you've got hotels with quite big kind of gardens and setbacks, and then the parking's usually behind them or further back anyway. So it would really be for a redevelopment. They'd try and keep that open space, but being on the highways, it's probably harder for some of them to, in future get on-site, on-street parking because of the NZTA's requirements. So it's really just trying to keep that kind of character in those two towns, given that it's limited to those towns only. And then beyond that, there's the other commercial zoning, which would provide for the other shops and that like we have now.
What through you, Mr. Chair, what about my other suggestion regarding permitted activities, say art and design galleries, something like that?
Yeah, and again, this is trying to reflect, this is dedicated for visitor accommodation. I mean, souvenirs and that, you could argue maybe artworks could be souvenirs if they're paintings of the area, but yeah, dedicated galleries are going to be in the commercial parts of those towns anyway. I've just got a note from Rachel too. The current plan has a 5 metre deep landscaping strip, so it's actually come back quite a lot to 1.5.
Okay.
All right, there being no further discussion on that, but because we hadn't dealt with part B, I'll ask the movers and seconders whether they're happy to also do the same with part B. Thank you. And so that was moved Councillor Hopkins, seconded Councillor Blackler. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Carried. Right, we now move to the mixed use zone. Chapter. Councillor Blackler.
Could I just make a general comment without having seen the final kind of mapping where it sits? It's quite hard to visualize all the context of all these chapters. So I just wanted to make that comment that we haven't actually seen that yet. So it does make it difficult.
I certainly share your concerns. I have received an email from Mr. Campbell saying that the mapping was due to be finalised towards the end of last week. Perhaps he can update us as to where we're sitting.
We've seen these zones.
Yes, yes.
We've seen these zones years ago, put bluntly. I mean, this is this is, I mean, in planning development terms, this is ancient history.
Yes,
And I don't mean to be rude to Councillor Backler, perhaps we should have simply accepted that a significant number of the members of the committee are new and should have had a guaranteed access to the mapping, but it has been made available in the past.
Mayor Kircher.
Yeah, I would have found it helpful to have them sitting alongside when we're talking about some of these areas. You know, we're talking about accommodation in Omarama and Otamatata, understanding exactly where is that versus where the overall commercial activity happens. And you know, and I just take Councillor Hopkins on his point that we've seen it years and years and years ago. It's ancient history. And this is precisely why we're actually undergoing a review of the district plan, is because things change. And maybe something that was years and years and years ago maybe need to be changed.
Yeah, good point.
Mr. Campbell, have you anything to add to that conversation?
Well, we could certainly try and show it now if that was those discrete areas, if you wanted to see them live. They're only on the draft plan, on the draft plan website, but if you wanted that context during this discussion, we can certainly try and get them on screen.
Yeah, that would be.
Yeah, but we're still waiting on the other map adjustments, particularly for the landscape mapping, to be worked through.
So is it fair to say that there would only be very, very minor changes to what we can see in these particular ones we're discussing today, that what went out in the draft, as opposed to some of the more rural kind of overlays, there might be significant changes.
That's right. So yeah, the mixed use out in the north end is just along Thames Highway. It extends just past Regina Lane. We've got the lolly shop and on both sides, and then it comes south back to so the sort of Farnham, Witham Street area, and then that hits the local centre zone that we're just talking about, and that kind of more concentrated area of shops there.
On the east side of the highway.
Both sides on that stretch of highway. That's the mixed use. So it's only basically a section or two wide there. And then quickly, there's a block between Orwell and Weaver Streets. We've got some businesses along there, sort of a couple of sections deep on the east side of the Thames Highway. Just in that wee block where you've got the tyre place and a few other businesses there. And then there's some around the harbour and Chelmer Street, so sort of scattered on the outskirts of the town centre, down the centre town, so quite limited there.
Thank you.
So is there any members of the committee who want to, right, thank you, Councillor Hopkins.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Few here, page 38, under MUZP3, number 1, scale, design and layout of the activity is compatible with the anticipated character and amenity of the surrounding area. I don't think the word anticipated should be there. I haven't seen it anywhere else in any of these chapters. And in my view, it's just wrong. It should, in my view, it should read as incompatible with the character and amenity. Because the difficulty with saying anticipated is what is anticipated, we're not saying. And so I just think the word anticipated should come out. On page bottom of 41, top of 43, this relates to marine industry, marine related industry activity. we just as curiosity really, well, not curiosity, it may be significant. Are we satisfied that a building with a gross area no more than 500 square meters is the right size? On page 51, oh, sorry. Okay.
Sorry, yeah, we'll just let staff respond.
Thank you. I'll come to the last question first, and then Katrina will go back to the other one. Yeah, I mean, whether the 500's right or not is debatable. It's kind of in a very discrete area in that sense. There was one set up recently in a building there under that threshold, but there's probably not, unless it was a new building, there wouldn't be too many buildings that size. But yeah, it's more the scale of that building in the context of that harbour area. So 500 is probably about right. It's still quite big, but that excludes any yard space, which they often have as well.
Okay, that's fine.
And over to Katrina for the anticipated wording.
Thank you. Through the chair, just going back to the query around policy 3 about use of the word or terminology anticipated character and amenity. That is a term that we use quite frequently throughout the plan. In the policies, we have an objective usually which sits in the zone chapters, which sets out what the character and qualities of the mix of that particular zone are. And that policy is then a reinforcement of that to support that objective.
I must have missed it elsewhere, so I apologise and retreat it as I have previously on more than one occasion in disarray. Yes. Pages 51, 52 and 53, 55. Again, I just question this absolute obsession with setbacks and why we are requiring that. If you look at Tyne Street for sake, now I know that, or even parts of Humber, where buildings are right to the footpath. And you could argue that one of the characteristics of Oamaru as a settlement is that earlier development did take structures right to the footpath. Certainly Thames, Tyne, I mean, and some of those are remember, originally warehouse and industrial spaces. So they are the kind that they were originally, the Harbour Precinct, the Heritage Precinct. It was originally exactly what this zone is meant to be now. So I just question why we are constantly saying you have to be back 2 meters, you have to have a continuous landscape strip. I really do wonder whether this isn't unduly prescriptive and or, put bluntly, middle class. Page 53, I'm just curious, when I look at this one under hours of operation for activities other than residential, I'm wondering why we've gone to only till 3 p.m. on Sundays and public holidays, when in other zones, such activities other than residential, generally speaking, this is the chapters this morning, the limit is 5 or later. I don't get the logic of saying you have to stop at 3 on Sunday, where we don't appear to be doing that in any of the other zones where those sorts of activities are permitted. And finally, on page 55, under standard S13, any habitable room window, this might seem pedantic, but any habitable room window must be at least 2 meters from any boundary except a road or railway boundary. I would personally like to see us stipulate that it also needs to be double glazed. We had that on the Banks Peninsula plan when people were complaining about noise from Port and Littleton. And we had World Health Authority data that with genuine health effects. So we required new builds to be double glazed. And I would really seriously recommend that we do the same thing if we are concerned about noise and the like. So those are my comments on that chapter.
Thank you, Councillor Hopkins.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, David. If I just let David answer, or do you want to challenge something Jim said?
Yeah, I do, because under the new regulations, and Roger can confirm that double glazing is part of the consent process in any new build.
It would be if it was a new build or a substantial renovation, but if it was using existing windows, not altering the outside of the building, then it wouldn't change.
Well, I took that to mean this reference under S13 to mean new builds. I'm not sure you could require retrofitting of windows in a building where they were currently not 2 meters from the road boundary. Okay, problem solved.
Thank you, councillor Percival. That was going to be my answer too. Going back to the setback question, most of that is a rollover from the current plan, and it wouldn't take away from existing use rights if those buildings already close to the road wanted to rebuild or repurpose. So the examples of buildings that are set back, new builds, there's ones that are already there, right on the edge. So it wouldn't affect them if they were rebuilding, but it's just to try and have a little bit more of some sort of amenity along some of those streets where there's not a lot at present, but that would only be through a complete demolition, and if they lost their existing use rights, to start again.
Councillor Blackler.
Oh, thank you. Forgive me, I probably should know the answer to this question, but would you be able to explain the impact of the rainwater tanks on the building coverage calculation, how that all ties in?
So again, if the building definition picks them up, which I'm pretty sure it would in this case, a rainwater tank, then they'd be part of that coverage equation.
So if you had greater than 5,000 litres, it would increase the amount of footprint that you could cover the site with. That's correct?
Yeah, so any above ground tanks would be part of the building's part of that building coverage equation. The only way around that, I guess, would be to put them underground under the building if you wanted to utilise more space for water storage, but not get caught out with the coverage aspect. Because they, I guess, have a impermeable surface on their top, and that runs off as stormwater. So it's part of that mix of impervious surface.
Oh, the tanks themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. The reason I asked is because I wonder if that's that kind of the content, the intent of that rule is perhaps counter to what we discussed earlier about trying to achieve with rainwater capture. And I'm not saying I have the answer here right now, but I'm just concerned that is counterproductive to trying to improve stormwater resilience, because you're adding more to the mix.
Yeah, sort of a chase your tail scenario where if you add more water storage, you're adding more building coverage. So what you mean there, but by and large, the area of the tanks would be quite small compared to a large, more industrial site with big roof areas. So they're probably quite an incremental, small percentage of the overall site on that basis anyway. So it really depends on the relativity of your site size, your other main building size, and the size of your tanks. So they might pick up a small percentage of the site coverage, but they're still performing a stormwater function. It really depends on the ratios, I guess.
But
Sorry, Mayor Kircher.
We're just picking up what Councillor Blackler is saying. I think, whether there's an exemption for any tanks solely used for rainwater collection or stormwater collection, just being quite specific, because if you've got a 2 metre high tank that's collecting rainwater, that's going to be probably more than what the equivalent ground underneath would soak into it. So, I think we need to find any mechanisms we can to contain stormwater on site. So if there's that small exemption for that purpose, then that is just again sending another signal that if you want to capture your rainwater use it on your garden later on or whatever. That's actually a good thing for us.
Yeah, I guess while we're fleshing this out, I think there's kind of two aspects to it, isn't it? That someone might use the rainwater tank to increase the site coverage in terms of the buildings. But there's also the stormwater resilience aspect. And so the two are kind of separate issues, which shouldn't be blurred, I guess, in whatever wording we.
Of course, home captured rainwater also offers a solution for those members of the community who don't want to be caught in the government policy that's saying that we may have to compulsorily put fluoride in the water system. So it's multiple benefits in encouraging us to go down that track. Thank you, Mr. Campbell.
Yes, I guess in this mixed use area, it's quite generous in terms of your building coverage at 70%. So that's a fair bit of your site covered. And then there's in tandem with that, there's the 10% of the site shall be pervious. So that's quite a small percentage, part of the remaining 30%, but 10% of your total site. So the 5,000 litre exemption is both for the coverage and the setbacks again. In a smaller tanks, or if you chose to go bigger, you either have to make it fit into that 70% or move it further from the boundary. But again, it's an avenue you could use for dealing with any landscaping. You have the on-site water there for irrigation, that type of thing. So kind of is trying to provide a ability to have some small on-site storage, but if you want to go bigger or closer, again, you can just rejig things or go through a consent process if it's a really tight squeeze. So it is tricky, but I guess 70% is quite generous in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I agree. If someone, just to clarify, the water tank's less than 5,000, if someone was to have multiple 5,000 litres, is that like, because the technology around tank design and stuff is probably changed in even just recent times with some of those quite smart looking very expensive tanks, but would that kind of thing be allowed for also, do you think?
And again, that sort of design would lend itself to tucking them under eaves, that type of thing as well, which are already covered in your coverage anyway. So there's ways around that by using that smarter narrow tank design and fit it under your building eaves or other parts of the building, not to trigger that coverage. So that can be one way around it for people.
I think the thing we need to bear in mind is a 5,000 litre tank is relatively small, and the normal tank that you would see travelling around is 30,000 to 33,000 litres.
Just further to that, I mean, these are generally, there's a mix of sites and that mixed use. They're generally some smaller ones, so that limits the room for big tanks anyway. But a bigger site, you would probably put a bigger tank on if you're going down that path.
Mr. Chair, I'm happy to move the chapter with amendments as agreed.
And I'm happy to accept that, Councillor Hopkins. And it's been seconded by Councillor Blackler. All those in favour? Aye. Carried. We move on to the town centre zone. Councillor Blackler.
I had a couple of questions on this one. So the first one was around the provision of the veranda, and I think we've answered that in earlier questions possibly, but I just wanted to ascertain why we need that provision. Given some areas of our street don't have verandas. And so that's policy 1. Policy 3, I wondered if at the end of the sentence we've got building, we should add buildings plural. And that's around the large format retail operating within existing buildings on Thames Street, although I acknowledge, and I'd be interested to hear perspectives from people around the table. Possibly that's in conflict with the intent of the large format chapter, but I just wanted to just have a quick discussion on that one. I kind of feel that I would like to see an add an additional policy. P9, I propose legislative requirements on building owners be the title, and the content of that could say something along the lines of recognise challenges owners face with respect to legislative requirements and generate planning outcomes and frameworks that encourage and enable revitalisation of buildings to be fit for purpose while preserving heritage characteristics. Because I think if we don't get this right, then, based on the earthquake strengthening requirements and, many others that building owners are faced with, we won't see the incentive to work on these buildings.
Councillor Blackwell, I'll just stop you there so that staff can respond, and then we'll come back to you.
Okay, firstly on the veranda one, this relates to building development. So if it's existing buildings, it wouldn't necessarily pick those up. So there are gaps along there now. So sorry,
Not many.
there's a few more on this side probably. Yeah. So that would be like we're saying, the new building along here where they do provide it, or the BNZ building, for instance, they've got some sort of glass thing there, but not a full veranda. So it's just trying to maintain that kind of continuity, I guess, but accepting that it's not continuous all the way along each side. But those buildings that redevelop or repurpose, I wouldn't necessarily trigger them to have to go and stick a veranda like that by virtue of this.
So if it's kind of not already within the theme of the frontage where the development might occur, it wouldn't have to have a veranda. It's just a continuation in areas that are already kind of established if there was a redevelopment. Is that correct?
Well, Mr. Chair, it has to be, because the rule says that it has to be continuous with and make contact with the veranda next door. So if there is no veranda next door, the rule can't apply. And there are one or two places along Thames Street, especially on the western side, where, as Councillor Blackler and Mr. Campbell have pointed out, no verandas do exist. But with the new build that went through a complex and convoluted planning hearing, we did require a veranda to be included in that design because there were existing verandas on either side. But interestingly enough, in that instance, the veranda in front of that building is not identical to the verandas on either side of it. What?
Councillor Percival.
Yeah, David, TCZ P7, activities inappropriate for a town centre. Can you give me some indication of what they would be?
Okay.
60. Yeah.
Yeah, page 60.
So that'd be more industrial type activities, that type of thing that we don't want in our kind of lower Main Street area. Yeah. Yep. So you're going into the branches. So the TCZ R1 building activity rule trigger there is external alterations and additions to existing buildings and structures picking up, councillor Hopkins' point, likes of, further along, if there's no veranda on either side, then it would be crazy to require a sort of a veranda in that sense. Yeah.
Can we cover off the other matters that councillor Blackler raised? I'm interested in the policy proposal. I think it may require a little bit of tweaking, probably simplify the wording towards the end just to describe it as adaptive reuse. But I do think that adding that policy has merit. Policy along those lines.
I would agree. Mr. Campbell, do you want to comment on
We'll
that?
come to that one. The other one was around the large format retail activity, which was policy P3. And it is talking about where it's establishing in an existing building singular. So it's saying that if it's a large format retail activity within the zone, and it's compatible, then it can, it's saying establish in an existing building. I mean, there might be more than one building potentially, but intent of the rule is to say a large, format retail, whatever it might be. It's trying to control that rather than perhaps the extent of buildings, but there may be the case where it could be across more than one building. I don't think that would matter in a policy rule, policy wording so much. It's just kind of giving the direction for the policy, what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, okay, yeah, it was more, it's not something I feel fixed on in any particular manner. I just wanted to kind of just drill into the context of it either being singular or plural.
Well driven.
So can I just interrupt you, Councillor Blackler? You just said something quite critical, I think, to this process. Whilst we discuss and understand what this is saying, if we're not absolutely prescriptive in what we mean, the next lot of people around this table may not interpret it the same way. So I think it's quite critical.
Right, so going back to the policy suggestion, I guess it's a tricky one where the town centre zone objective talks about the type of activities it's seek to provide for, which lists them commercial, visitor accommodation, residential, recreational, educational, community. So it's already quite wide and encompassing. And we'll have to be careful in a district plan policy setting document that we're not kind of talking about other legislative issues that might pop up or people wanting to do things in that zone. So there's always going to be, Building Act for building changes, Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act for liquor sales and shop, cafes, whatever, food registrations, all that type of thing. So we're going to be careful not to sort of unpack all the what ifs for those range of activities. And bearing in mind, some council activity work stream happening with sort of placemaking role in terms of that town centre revitalisation type work. So that would probably try and address those issues specifically. Whereas this policy framework is kind of setting up the things we'd want to encourage in that zone, some things we trying to manage in terms of effects. So we've got to be careful about sort of, it's a good intent to have that type of policy or thinking, but putting it in this setting is probably not quite the right place. It might be more at a council activity level as opposed to in a district plan. So I guess, we've got to stick to kind of what the district plan can and can't achieve, notwithstanding those things are already there anyway. I think the objective kind of covers off what we're signalling people could do in that zone. We'd like to encourage them to do, but it can work alongside things like the Heritage Fund as well for that kind of helping heritage building owners, for instance. But some of those other things are probably a bit outside the plan to try and write it in. It's getting a bit we get a bit clunky if we had all that in there, I think.
I was just going to say thanks for that. I mean, I think Councillor Hopkins is right. Like the wording could do with some tweaking, but I would like to see something along the lines of, you know, what I expressed, but I do take your point, Mr. Campbell, about trying to anticipate which legislation will and won't have an impact. Councillor Hopkins, did you have some questions? Or
I did, yes. Look, just a comment. I think I have a feeling, and thinking the matter through, David may be right. I'm not sure that what you want is a planning policy. It should perhaps be a council policy in relation to other administrative matters, or the way we exercise jurisdiction and so forth. I don't know quite how the policy could be articulated or manifest itself in planning terms, whereas all of the other ones here can. So whether we end up with that rule in the plan or not, the merit of the idea is indisputable. Whether the plan is the right place for that particular expression of that particular notion is maybe a tad more problematic. I'm happy to think about it for a wee while. Just looking at my issues or questions, page 59 of our agenda this morning, policy P2, residential activity and visitor accommodation. I don't want to change the policy, but I do want to suggest to us all that the notion expressed in number 1 is becoming increasingly problematic. I know that Peter Garvin was absolutely passionate about not having any residential or other development on the ground floor front, and I get the logic of that, and that's essentially why that particular stipulation that it's located away from the active street frontage is there. But you look at the street now, even in the time since we debated that rule, and now you look at the area between Weir and Coquette, I think there's only one or two shops open. So I think we need to have perhaps a discretionary or restricted discretionary provision in here somewhere that might allow ground floor frontage residential accommodation with the proviso that it includes agreed provisions to maintain an active street frontage. Now, what that might mean is, you know, setting a residential use back a bit from the immediate frontage from the street. Look, I don't know, but I'm just saying I have a feeling that might be problematic. So that's number 1 on that page. Policy P3, I would suggest, with some vehemence or some intensity, that we reword that to read restrict large format retail activity within the town centre zone, except where establishing in an existing building. I would not have the qualification where it is incompatible with, because we've set up a special zone to deal with it. And in my view, the policy should say restrict large format retail activity within the town centre zone, except where establishing in an existing building. Moving to page 61, I would delete permitted 3 completely. There it says where the building is on Thames Street and does not adjoin the street boundary, it shall be set back no greater than 2 metres from the street boundary. I don't quite get it, but if it means that you can actually go back 2 metres on Thames Street, it shouldn't, and we shouldn't be allowing that. We have a continuous built framework. The street is, look at the street, look at Harbour, look at Tyne Street, look at Thames. Every building is to the footpath. And in my view, that's an essential part of the heritage character and should be maintained. So if there's any possibility that permitted 3 would allow that to change, I would delete it.
Councillor Hopkins, I'll just let staff speak to those before you carry on. Mayor Kircher, did you want?
Yeah, again, looking at the residential activity and so forth, this is where it'd be good to have a refresher of where the map is may have been amended to. You know, are we contracting the that the applicable area as part of this process.
Well, I think it runs from, okay.
Yeah, I can help with that. So the town centre starts at Ribble Street along Thames and heads south. It also goes along 7th Street to the Cross Street corner on that top side, north side, and then all the way down Thames. And then at Coquette Street, it goes right out to Humber. And then it carries on down on the west side of Humber Street, both sides of Thames. And then it picks up that first block of Tees and Tyne Streets, right up to Wansbeck. And on both sides of Tees, both sides of Tyne. So yes,
That is smaller than the existing, or
probably, yeah, it might be a bit longer on Tees, Tyne Street area, I think a wee bit extended there.
It's the same as in the draft.
Yeah,
yeah, which was changed from, yes, that's.
Yeah, so in terms of the residential, I'm just looking at the rule, I'll get to that. All right, TCZR8, which is on page 64. So that's the rule that reinforces the policy. I guess if there's ways around it, I guess you have a small commercial activity space in the front, you could then have a residence behind that. And it's just trying to make sure that people aren't kind of deliberately living right up to the street, and that could cause issues for people in the building, let alone that street frontage not having a kind of more commercial presence. I might hand it to Rachel on this setback one as well. I think that was discussed earlier, so.
Through the chair, so the suggestion to delete per 3 that enables a 2 metre setback. We're happy to delete that. The chapter was drafted, I think, originally with it to the street and no ability for a setback. And a change came about over time.
Why would someone seek, or why would it be appropriate to have a setback?
Well, it isn't.
From a planning perspective?
Pass, but I guess that does provide some flexibility, and I believe that was the intent of the committee at a workshop when it was brought in. Just to provide a bit of flexibility rather than a hard and fast, thou must set up, build up to the street.
Thank you. I think on the balance, I agree with Councillor Hopkins.
Trina?
It's okay. I think all I was going to add to that, I think part of that discussion that we had at a previous workshop was to allow for those some frontages have got slightly angled sort of door frontage, and it was just to allow for that because obviously they're set back a little bit from the actual street boundary. Yeah.
Just moving on then very quickly, page 62, policy R3, large format retail. Any large format retail activity is located within a building. Now these are permitted activities, remember. Any large format retail activity is located within a building existing as of the date and requiring no modification. I'd like to see those 3 words added. It doesn't mean that an existing building can't be used with modification, but it would make it restricted, discretionary or discretionary. So I'm suggesting that those words, along with deletion of the words in the policy previously, be added. Moving on to page 65.
Sorry.
Moving on to page 65.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Councillor, I just so that can we get an answer on that, Mr. Campbell, so that it can be incorporated in the meeting notes in the right place.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just picking up on Councillor Hopkins' point about the adjusted wording to the large format retail activity, that would actually be picked up under Town Centre Zone Rule 1, which triggers a consent for or lists a number of standards that need to be met for any external alterations and additions to existing buildings and structures.
Right. So what you're saying is those people what you're saying is that the rules cover that and those 3 words don't need to be added. That's fine. Can I ask you, are you happy to delete the words I suggested being removed from the policy earlier?
I guess on that one, we're trying to say with that incompatible, that's the wording you want to remove, Councillor Hopkins.
Yes.
I guess got to be careful there what we wish for, because something might pop up and we say we didn't expect that to be in the town centre zone and we didn't want it there, but that is large format retail. So yeah. It's just a balancing thing, isn't it, really? It's sort of a tricky one. I mean, it's talking about in an existing building, so I think it would limit it to an extent anyway.
All right. Just finally then on page 65, industrial activity R9, again, we've got the making of arts and crafts products or food and beverage processing. I'm just wondering if, I know we've had furniture manufacturers and, now we've got sort of design manufacturing outlets down the heritage area. I'm wondering if we couldn't have a slightly more generous allowance for the types of activity that might be permitted. And as I say, we have seen furniture makers down there now, or previously, I should say, and I'm not sure that the making of arts and crafts products would actually run to furniture in the same way that I wasn't sure that souvenirs covered could be captured by galleries. So I'm just suggesting a slight amplification of what might be deemed to be permitted.
Did you have any suggestions on, I mean, the rules kind of a rollover from what we had minus the furniture manufacturing, but we could probably look at adding that back in if you felt. But hey, you don't want to end up with a big shopping list of.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I'm loath to use the word designer products, making of arts and crafts products, including domestic furniture, perhaps.
Domestic items.
Including domestic items.
No, that could be quite wide ranging. That'd be pretty good. I was thinking instruments, guitars.
Well, that's true, yeah. Well, that's arts and crafts, I would have thought, guitar manufacturer.
Would the homewares cover it?
Well, that's, yeah, arts, crafts and homewares, yeah, that's might be the word, well done.
The problem is the more prescriptive we become, the more restrictive potentially as well. So we have to balance the two.
Well, what I'm suggesting is that I'm suggesting slightly less prescriptive rule 9 by adding at least one other general category. Because at the moment it's limited to arts and craft products and food and beverage processing and manufacturing. I'm just suggesting that it be a little less restrictive.
This is only about the making of them, so it's not selling.
Yeah.
I guess you got to be careful putting in things like homewares, because you end up with a Tupperware factory, for instance. You might not want. Yeah, but yeah, it's tricky.
We're going to die wondering as to whether Councillor Hopkins gets his furniture manufacturing included, or we don't.
We probably could slot some homewares in there, making of arts and craft and homeware products, I guess.
Yes, let's do it. On the basis of the project solutions.
Might be with a revival of Tupperware.
I'm just conscious of the fact that our enemy time is catching up. We are scheduled to break for 15 minutes for a short break. So I've got a question from councillor Percival first.
Page 71, TCZ S4, shopping fronts, verandas. With the recent construction and refurbishing on Thames Street, particularly on the western side from here down to State Highway 1, how is that applied or not been applied? Does it come through the consent? And it obviously only applies to new builds or refurbishing. So because that's pretty definite what it says here, why has that not applied to the new builds that construction that's happened recently?
Yes, so the current rules, not these ones, would have applied, and if they saw consent, they can seek to not put in verandas. So that's always part of a consent process, but these will be the new rules going forward for future ones. But yeah, some of the existing ones or stuff you've seen lately would have been under the current district plan, not this one. Yeah.
Okay.
Councillor Blackler.
I'm just going to make a comment here that could be considered contentious by others, but I'd like to see us test the mood of the community, and under TCZ S1, I think we should be lifting the height from 12 metres to 15 or 16 or whatever's required to add an additional at least one story, which would then conversely mean that under S2 we'd need an additional requirement for like a street frontage recession plane from the 12-metre mark.
I'm not averse to that idea. I just wonder whether 15, I'm thinking 2 metres is standard house height now. A domestic story is about 8 feet, which is 200 bit metres, isn't it?
2.3.
2.4 metres. And maybe, I mean, I'm just wondering about 15. I get the logic of it. Yeah, if it is 2.4, maybe it has to be 15. I wouldn't be opposed to that personally, in the town centre area, because it may actually facilitate adaptive reuse. But I mean, I'm open to the opinions of others as well.
That was kind of where my point was with the policy around, you know, getting the framework, the planning framework right to suit, you know, the incentivization of better utilization of these spaces. That was kind of the angle I was coming at from the policy.
Councillor Percival.
Yeah, well, I'll be totally opposed to that suggestion within the town zoning. I mean, you only got to look at other cities in the world that have retained a minimum height that's acceptable in big cities like Paris or Athens and all that sort of thing. I mean, it would destroy, as far as I'm concerned, our heritage site.
Mr. Campbell.
Thank you. I guess the 12 metres isn't an absolute, it's a starting point, and if it triggers consent, you've got the 5 items of discretion there that pick up some of Councillor Percival's points he made, probably quite validly in terms of, yeah, we've got the town centre design guidelines, the consideration around heritage buildings, etc. And we'd probably, I don't know, be many buildings over 12 metres at present, other than maybe some of the sort of clock towers of this building, that type of thing, more one-offs. But I guess that's trying to say, well, 12 metres is kind of acceptable in the context of the town centre zone right through to, Wandsbek Street. So if people want to go higher, then they can certainly go through the consent process, and we are only looking at those 5 items of discretion anyway. So it might be best to keep a bit of a check and balance there. Otherwise, 15 without any controls could be quite drastic. In terms of the recession plane, it probably wouldn't add much value, because at 12 metres anyway, you're probably going to be shading the street entirely, or most of it. So a recession from 12 metres up is probably not going to be much benefit.
I was just it was just a suggestion off the back of, you know, observing some of the building design in Cuba Street up in Wellington. They have the 3 stories, and then the top story is set back. Well, not on all of them, but some of them. But I guess I'm putting this forward on the basis it is proposed, and I'd like to test the mood and the view of the community. But I do want to make clear, like I'm not seeking to minimise the importance of the heritage nature of our streets in any way, shape, or form.
Mr. Chair, this is probably has potential got a lot of time this morning. I don't mean given Guy's strenuous opposition and David's point about what the matters of discretion are. The matters of discretion would allow a designer or another building owner to come along with a Cuba Street style proposal.
Correct.
It simply would mean that they'd have to test it through an assessment process before consent was granted. It wouldn't be automatically made available. I would have thought that it is somewhat to my surprise, but as a fact, no property owners, no landlords, no building owners have submitted or argued for an increase in the maximum height along the street in terms of submissions to date. They just, as we might say, 15, and they were in the community or submitters say no. If we say 12, submitters can say take it higher and present Section 32 arguments that might persuade us to do that. So I'd be almost inclined, given that I don't want to have a big fight here this morning,
No.
I'd be almost inclined to let it stand on the basis that other people can advocate for the change rather than us.
No, I take your point, and I tend to concur. The fact is, there's still the opportunity for someone to go through that process. I understand, Councillor Blackler, that you're saying we could test that process here, but I think it's probably better addressed on an individual building basis as against the whole zone.
Yeah, I do accept those points. I guess I'm trying to express the fact that we've got this process happening in parallel around CBD revitalisation, and there must be a tipping point where revitalisation and the urbanisation aspect needs to be helped by the planning framework. So that's where I'm coming from with that one.
All right, we're going to break, but is there any more discussion on this chapter?
I'll move the document with amendments approved.
Thank you, Councillor Hopkins. Seconded, Councillor Percival. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Carried. All right, we're going to take a very quick break. So we're scheduled for a 15-minute break, which means we'll be back at 20 to 11.
Yes.
Yeah. Believe you, David, we've got the red down at.
Excuse me, Mr. Chief. Why not?
Mr. Chair, large format retail, I have, sorry.
We're just,
Yeah, look, three things very quickly. On page 78, permitted activity at the very bottom for a residential unit, the footprint and height of the building are the same as that of the existing residential unit that was on the site on the 12th of February 2024. No, I just don't get it. I mean, if it was a residential unit, why are we saying that it has to have the same footprint and height? It just seems to me to be unnecessarily prescriptive. Page 83, this is my old bugbear about road boundary setbacks. Again, I just question, why are we having a road boundary setback? Now I get the logic of the 10 metres from the where the boundary is adjacent to a residential zone. I don't get the logic of the 2 metres from all the other road boundaries, and in that context, policy S8 or standard S8 on the next page, 84. Does the landscape strip of a minimum depth of 1 metre mean that the setback becomes 3, or is that 1 metre within the setback of 2?
I would think that logic would mean that that's part of the 2 metre, but
Okay. I just don't see why we are saying everybody has to be set back from the road. I would continue to argue that there's a lot of Oamaru's industrial and commercial development where buildings go right to the footpath.
Thank you, Councillor Hopkins. This is quite a limited extent of zone. And by and large, a lot of it's already built now. So it's probably not going to create too many issues, but it's just to really avoid too much building dominance on the street. In that main street setting, it's different where it's joining residential, but it's kind of saying we don't want the building kind of right up, because large format, it's different to the heritage type buildings. But yeah.
No, perhaps on second thoughts, I take your point. What about that permitted activity with regard to the residential unit? It just seems to me to be needlessly prescriptive.
Yeah, it almost reads like an existing use rights type provision. But I guess because the zone is aimed at large format retail, someone might be doing a residential unit or keeping one in there, but the zone's really about trying to allow for the large scale commercial buildings as opposed to residential, but it's basically saying it's like an existing use rights provision. But
I totally get the logic.
Not necessary to maybe remove it.
Well, no, I mean, my view is it's not so much. I get the logic of it, and I get the way you're trying to manage it. I simply don't see why we are saying the footprint and the height must be the same as an existing residential unit. I mean, if somebody wants to build a house there, and you might say to yourself, well, it's not the optimum place to build a house, given that it is a large, get the wording, but you know what I mean. So it may not be an optimum residential site, but why are we saying if you want to build something new there and live in it, it has to be the same footprint and it has to be the same height as whatever was there on the 12th of February 2024? It just doesn't make sense.
Through the chair, thank you, Councillor. Sorry, I'll get my words out straight now. Thank you, Councillor Hopkins. Just in terms of addressing that building activity rule there, I guess what it's trying to do is, because the standards in that particular zone are quite prescriptive in terms of addressing large format retail activities. If you were to put a new residential unit in that zone, then you would have no additional sort of standards that would kick in, because the standards in that zone are primarily addressed towards large format retail. So it's just really to give a baseline for existing properties that are there, and if there's a requirement to replace or update an existing dwelling.
So there maybe then if we so discretionary one compliance is not achieved with so we're basically we are saying you can do something different, and I know that we are. I get the logic of it now, Katrina. I understand why you've said what you've said. That makes sense. Once again, I retreat in disarray.
Well, that's absolutely brilliant. If no one else wants to put their head above the trenches and have to retreat, do we have someone who's prepared to move the chapter as proposed? Thank you, Councillor Blacklow. Seconded, Councillor Percival. All those in favour, please say aye. Carried. We now move on to the light industrial zone. Councillor Hopkins, would you like to start the turkey shoot and put your head above the trenches first, or?
Yeah, look, I do have a few things here. Page 89. I personally would like to see us add under the objectives under O2. I'd like to see us either add an additional 7 or amalgamate combine what's already there with some additional wording. I'd like to see us specifically say light industrial zone accommodates activities and development of size, nature, scale, and anticipated built form that is compatible with adjacent residential use. Because I think in this light industrial zone, we do have a mixture of houses and houses and industry, certainly around that Humber Street area east of Thames Street and so on. If you look at O3 on that page, 89, commercial activities do not occur within a light industrial zone in order to maintain and enhance the function, integrity and viability of retailing in the town centre. But then if you go to 92, it seems to allow commercial activity, and it only relates there to rule 3 only relates to offices. So yeah,
Working in progress.
oh, thank you. So yeah, page 93. I mean, in my view, I'm just curious as to why R3 only specifies offices. And that's right. Yes, if you look at it, R3 says ancillary retail. Well, the objective earlier says there's no retail, and yet R3 says there can be, or implies there can be, under the heading ancillary retail or office activity. Then on page.
Hang on,
Okay,
we'll get a response here. Can I just say that I would imagine in the light industrial zone, for example, if it was an engineer's and I wanted to go there and buy some bolts, that would be a retail activity, but it would be associated with the light industrial. It's not going and buying coffee cups that are outside that realm. But Mr. Campbell?
Yes, Mr. Chair, that's exactly the kind of thing it's trying to do, is say, yes, you can have a small retail component, but it's not the primary activity. Okay. That's just getting that balance right. So we don't take away from the town centre that's primarily about retail. This is more the supporting a service industry that might, as Mr. Thompson said, sell a bit of engineering equipment on the side. But
then I would be inclined to ask the officers whether objective 03 should read commercial activities unrelated to the industrial activity do not occur.
yeah, I guess it's sort of giving that clear signal that we're not wanting them commercial activities as a whole, as a singular activity focus to be in that zone as opposed to a town centre or local centre. And again, the E-plan will link to the definition. So if people click on commercial, they go, oh, it is actually a sole commercial activity. So I think the clarity will come through there. In terms of the other question about the residential side, I think under LIZ 02, number 5 kind of links to the maintain the amenity values of adjacent residential and rural zones. So that's
Okay, yeah.
would generally address that, I think, pretty well. Yeah.
Just then, moving very quickly then to 93, I think. Oh, no, 93, we just need to, and under R5, we need to have that date at the bottom under 1. And 99, I had a question up there with me for a moment. And again, look again, it relates to the landscaping of the road boundary. And I question why we are insisting that a continuous landscape strip is required for the minimum depth 2 meters along the full road boundary. It just, it just seems to me to be unduly prescriptive.
Thank you, Councillor Hopkins. The landscaping kind of ties into the setback rule where there's a 2 metre setback anyway, and then this is saying, well, in that area we want something in there, so it's just not a wasteland of 2 metres. But
all right,
just trying to overall lift the amenity along those areas.
Okay,
but
yeah, if you're insisting on a 2 metre setback, and I don't think we should, but I don't think I've got support from other members of the committee. So, but if we are insisting on the 2 metre setback, then better that it is landscape than not. Chair, I'm happy to move the chapter.
Thank you, Councillor Hopkins. I'm happy to second it from here. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Carried. We move to the general industrial zone chapter. Invite members to make any comments they want to on this chapter. Councillor Blackler.
Just for my benefit, Mr. Campbell, could you please describe the rough location of these areas? I know they're mentioned in the introduction as well, but just wanted to clarify.
Right.
Just well, Mr. Campbell's finding that the area in described in Palmerston is basically the service stations and heading down towards the transport down in that Boroness area. So there's a couple of workshops, the actual recovery centres there and the transport. So that's really quite a concentrated industrial zone.
Mr. Chair, while Dave was looking for that, for the map, could I perhaps ask Katrina and Rachel for comment on page 104, objective 03. Industrial activities located in the general industrial zone are not compromised by the establishment of activities, including commercial activities and sensitive activities that are potentially sensitive to odour, etc. I believe the word potentially should be deleted. And that it should read, including commercial and sensitive commercial activities and sensitive activities that are sensitive to odour. I think again, it's just I don't like the potentially there. It's too ambiguous, and let's be explicit. You can't do it if you can't do A, B, or C if what you're doing generate sensitivity to odour, dust, noise, traffic and other visual effects. So I would advocate the deletion of the word potentially.
I would agree.
Yep, we can make that change. So just going back to councillor Blacklow's question, so Weaver Street's kind of the start where the wall spinners site is, so it picks up that, and then it tends to be more along the coast, east of the railway line, further north of there. So it's kind of picking up those yards and businesses along there, end of Regina Lane type area. And then obviously it sort of comes to a halt there. We've got Waitaki Boys, and then it starts again and then extends out to the past Waitaki Boys, north of there extends out east of the railway line, right up to the north, also to the other side of Shortland Road, so west of there. So it's kind of those strip of blocks, some of which are starting to be developed, and then the North End Business Park land as well.
So the North End Business Park is included.
Yeah, the one that's slightly different in there is Lean Meats is more a heavy industrial zones. It's kind of an island of heavy industrial and amongst general industrial.
Thank you.
So it's quite a defined area, but it's sort of picking up those less mixed use areas, but it's more definitive industrial, but sort of more heavy nature yards, transport yards, all that type of thing. Plus factories. Yeah.
Mr. Chair, I'm happy to move the adoption of the chapter with amendments as agreed.
Thank you, councillor Hopkins. Are you happy to second that, councillor Percival? I thought you were, thank you. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Carried. We move into the heavy industrial zone.
Mr. Chair, I have one. On page 125, again, I'm sorry, I maybe sound as though I'm obsessive about this, but I simply don't get the logic of insisting under standard S4 that any building or structure must be set back a minimum of 20 metres from the road boundary. I mean, why? Why 20? I'm trying to think about essentially this covers Pekiri and Lean Meats. Given where they both are, why are we insisting on this? It just doesn't, to me, maybe a setback if you want to have one for car parking or vehicle access or whatever, but 20 metres, it just seems to be ludicrously excessive.
Is that an amendment from the current plan?
No, that's the new zone.
Oh,
Yeah, I mean, if we look at those sites now, they generally comply. So I think they would provide room for parking or whatever if they wanted to put that in front of their buildings anyway. But it's, I guess, the scale and nature of those buildings that maybe requires or justifies a bigger setback just because of the nature of what they are.
Well, you guys, I guess, let me suggest that we amend it to 10 metre setback. Yeah. It looks as though everybody's just sticking their finger in the air and having a guess.
So it has generally reflected the current rules, the 20, but there was, I think, some feedback to reduce it. So we could look at that if.
Well, I'm happy for personally, I'm happy for the planners to, I mean, obviously this is going to be adopted by council and you could come back to us with it. We have considered this and we now suggest that be, so I'm perfectly happy if you guys want to have a look at it again, let's just leave it there for now.
I'll just take a comment from councillor Blacklow.
Yes.
Just on that, sorry, we could probably go to 10, I think it's probably acceptable in these two limited scenarios.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to just voice that I support it as it is. I don't see any need to reduce it.
So, all right, we need to test the feeling of the subcommittee in terms of we have two camps, a 10 metre or 20 metre setback. Councillor Percival, are you a 10 or a 20? 10. I'm a 10, councillor Hopkins is a 10, and of course the mayor's a 10. We've seen that in his stage performance. So it looks like that's your turn to retreat, councillor Blackler.
Mr. Chair, I'll move the adoption of the chapter with amendments as agreed.
Thank you, councillor Hopkins. Do we have a seconder? Mayor Kircher, thank you. All those in favour, please say aye. Carried. We now move on. No, the mayor did. We move on to the open space zone. Well, it looks a bit like it. Either that or it refers to the intellectual capacity of the elected members of council, an open space zone. Councillor Hopkins, you have an opinion?
Yeah, just a couple of things here very quickly. Page 129, some of these chapters I suspect might have been drafted a while ago. Objective 01 is not an objective as it's currently worded, it's a statement. And I think it needs to read purpose of the open space zone to support a range of. And also looking on the same page in 03, just looking at how everything else begins with a verb protect, enable, maintain. I suggest 03 should read maintain public health and safety through the appropriate provision of infrastructure. Page 135. Can somebody please, I'm looking at standard S1 and I don't understand it. And therefore I suspect people reading the rule, the chapter might not. Any buildings and structures must not exceed a maximum height of 5 metres as measured from ground level, except that no building for an activity shall exceed the maximum height determined by a 1 7 transitional side surfaces gradient or by a 140 takeoff. So I don't get that. And if somebody can explain that to me and maybe reword it a little bit more clearly, I'd be grateful. And again, I'm looking at the hours. If you go to page standard S6 on page 157 through to 158, the hours of operation of any commercial activity must not operate outside the following hours. This is extraordinary. This is open space zone, and we're saying you can do things till 10 p.m. on Sunday to Thursday and 11:30 p.m. in the evening Friday to Saturday. And I'm just querying the logic of those time constraints. So those are my three matters.
All right, Mr. Campbell.
Thank you, councillor Hopkins. The hours of operation are deliberately a bit longer because it would provide for greater range of activities that might go into night time, such as evening sports, that type of thing. Yeah, okay. So that type of thing. So it gives a bit more flexibility, so we don't get caught out with after work sports practices, that type of thing. Yeah,
that makes sense. Thank you.
The rule around the airport approach is a difficult one, and even our current plan has some of us stumped as to how it works. But essentially, it's if you can imagine the airstrip, and then you have a flight path of aircraft coming in and out, and it's basically a gradation of heights get higher as you move further away from the airstrip. Okay. So it's an envelope within which we're trying to constrain buildings from popping up through that flight approach. Right. So it's generally each end of the runway and a fan going out because they don't come in directly straight. And at the sides, it's also a bit of a transition, but a steeper gradient. So it will be shown on the maps, but it is quite hard to get your head around.
To save time, it may have to be as complicated and technical as it is simply to cover off legal things. And it specifically relates to a couple of places, or O'Marama most particularly, possibly on the record as well. Okay, that's fine.
Councillor Blackler.
I just had three things here. I just wondered why visitor accommodation is discretionary. But I thought it might be something to do with campgrounds and the like. And was interested in building coverage in OSZ S3, 15% or total number of maximum square meters. But is this kind of offset or solved by open space to S4, and that creates a further limitation on that one? OSZ, I propose that we add an additional objective, OSZ 04, that discusses the protection of spaces that deliver the opportunity for important community, social and wellbeing outcomes, and also propose an additional policy 6, future development and access to open space. So the intent behind that would be to ensure areas for future development have open space in close proximity.
Mr.
Yeah,
Chair,
councillor.
we do have a playgrounds policy requires at the moment, whether it's short or not, it's a moot point, but at the moment, it has to be playgrounds within 500 meters or something of the sort. I'm not sure that we can stipulate that all new development has to have open space immediately nearby. That would be problematic. I get Councillor Battler's other objective. I wouldn't have any aversion to adding something along those lines, but it would be helpful if we had a set of words.
Mr. Campbell?
I'll come back to that last point in a minute. The building coverage one is, I guess, picks up that they are generally sites not dominated by buildings, so 15% is still quite a bit when you think about a site, but the two rules do work in tandem as you've identified, so I think that kind of helps limit the extent of buildings and the scale of them as well. So yeah. So the other question was around the additional objectives, or was there one else?
It was a suggested objective around, not sure what the specific title might be, but the wording would be something like the protection of spaces that deliver the opportunity. Oh, actually, sorry, in objective 4, it was to add number 4 to that, that said the protection of spaces that deliver the opportunity for important community, social and wellbeing outcomes.
Okay, I guess and you sort of read through the first one, 01, the purpose, and then policy P1 is around enabling activities and use. And maybe pick up Councillor Hopkins' point around the kind of council may have its own kind of policy around reserve management plans, that type of thing that might pick up that. Whereas this is kind of saying that against that planning framework to say what we're trying to encourage in these areas versus the kind of how we might manage them per se. There's that kind of difference between setting the platform or framework for how things can operate in there. Then if we're an operator in that space, we can do that through our own management plans, perhaps.
Mayor Kircher?
My concern with that fourth objective would be that it doesn't in itself take into account what's already there. It's very easy to say that bit of ground's needed for the well-being of the community without actually saying, well, there's 16 hectares sitting right beside it, but is actually achieving all of that, and that's there is ample space allocated in that area, but whereas other areas there may not be. It's certainly reminiscent of a discussion we've had recently.
That's true. The other thing is we have the financial contributions policy that requires subdivisions and the like to either provide space for outdoor recreation and in the area or a financial contribution. So were we to feel that at the moment we're only requiring payment of monies, not additional land, but were we to identify a development that we felt actually needed land and some open space for recreational use, then we could do that through the financial contributions policy we have now.
Thank you, Councillor Hopkins.
Which is exactly why I'm seeking that that our plan sets out to do that.
Yep, I think,
Mr.
just building on councillor Hopkins' point that financial contributions mechanism would be reflected in the subdivision side of things. So there's usually three considerations. Is one, it goes, new subdivisional development goes to the parks team. They assess whether they need more reservable park space nearby, and picking up the Mayor's point on that. And then if they do, that's a negotiation with the developer, who may choose to vest land instead of pay the money, and or they may also do some works to put some infrastructure on that land. So the last one example I can think of is up at Bluestone Heights there, where they basically gave up a section, or not gave up, but contributed a section and some works to offset that contribution. So it was all worked through in terms of the need for it, the type of facility and so on. So that's all kind of covered, as others have said, in those other provisions. This is about the actual existing open space zones per se. So we don't really need it in here.
Because it is covered under separate powers that we have. I think we don't need to get too much into it here, but I would say that we have also fallen into a situation where basically a whole playground is set aside for a very, very small part of the community, because that's essentially what happened in the Bluestone Heights example, when just along the road there was a destination playground already there. So that's refinement of our existing policy in another area of activity though, so won't go into it here. Thank you.
All right, we've had a fairly comprehensive discussion on that chapter.
Just report, I'm happy to move, but the other objective that Councillor Blackler proposed, can you we're not talking about the provision of proximity to open space, but what was your other one, Tim? Because I saw more merit in that.
It was just so that one we just discussed was a suggested policy around future development and access to open space. But the initial one that I sought to add was and sorry, I wasn't clear. I've mixed up my numbering here, which is why it won't have made sense. But under OSZ number 02. Or O2, objective 2, I was proposing that we add a fourth item there that says open space to ensure, and then number 4, the protection of spaces that deliver the opportunity for important community, social and wellbeing outcomes.
I don't have a difficulty with that. What? Pardon? Carry on. I personally wouldn't be averse to that being added. I mean, because we are talking about map zones anyway, and it might be that it's a reasonable consideration to ensure that you don't have a landlocked zone. So unless the planners recoil in horror, I wouldn't be averse to adding that.
Yeah, I think we can probably include that as a fourth item on that objective.
All right. So I presume on that basis, Councillor Blackley, you're happy to move this chapter with the amendments discussed?
Yeah.
Thank you. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Hopkins. All those in favour, please say aye. Carried. And we move along to the sport and active recreation zone chapter.
Two things. Page 141, again, objective 01 is a statement, not an objective. And I would suggest it reads, purpose of the sports and active recreation zone to support a range of indoor and outdoor sport and recreational activities with associated facilities and structures that enable or assist local, regional and national sports and recreation events. And the other one I had on that, on this chapter, on page 150, standard S4, I'm just struggling again, if somebody can explain to me, why are we saying that all individual buildings and or structures, including external additions or alterations, must, as a permitted activity, must not exceed a maximum gross floor area of 200 square metres. So it seems extraordinarily prescriptive. Again, I'm just wondering if that's a little inflexible.
200 square metres is not a large floor space either.
I mean, I suppose a question, how might that affect the sports and event centre, for the sake of argument, just out of curiosity? Since we are talking about indoor and outdoor and indoor facilities. So I'm just wondering why we've got a maximum of 200 permitted.
The staff have a response to that question?
I guess it goes back to when the chapter was put together. It was kind of a threshold put forward then. I don't think there's been too much feedback on that, so you could leave it there, and if we want it bigger, deal with it through a submission, or it's probably going to affect new builds, and things like the event centre already in a approval process now, so it won't affect that per se. But
I would tend to be surprised if a sports club was building a club rooms. It would only be a very large club that would probably go beyond that, but it's still basically the floor plan of an average house being built today. All right, Councillor Blackler.
I just wondered if under Rule 4 permitted 1 R5 or number 5, I'd like to see a reference to or maybe it's implicit anyway, but I'd just like to clarify that there would be consideration for accessibility standards and design.
That would be picked up by the building code normally, that type of thing, so we wouldn't need to pick it up in here as such. Or are you talking about something over and above that?
The context of what I was thinking about was, like, say if a track was being built to access a specific area or site, that it would be done at the correct gradient and so forth.
Yeah, I think that would be down to the parks unit to make sure they meet those good design guidelines anyway. There's probably legislation that covers that now, I'd imagine. So it wouldn't need to be in here per se.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Just also going back to Councillor Hopkins' earlier point about the objective and policy wording, we can make that change to bring the wording forward again.
On that basis, I'll move the chapter with amendments as agreed.
Thank you, Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Councillor Blackler. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Carried. We move along to the Oamaru Harbour Precinct.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, two things. I think I know we had a conversation the other day. I can't remember what context, about heritage items. I do notice for everyone to actually maybe assuage the anxiety of some about whether or not individual items should be identified as having heritage listing, that the entire waterfront area and wharves are included within the Heritage New Zealand Oamaru Harbour Historic Area Heritage NZ list number 7536, with the breakwater also listed as a category 1 item. So that should give us all some comfort. At the bottom of that page, there is a statement that I don't think is correct. In the last paragraph, third line, it talks about sub-precinct A, and it goes on to say, it is a gateway area to the town centre. Well, I don't think it is. I get the logic that you might argue that if you're coming from the south, but I challenge that. I think that needs to be modified or removed. And the other thing, on page 155, both objectives are again statements. And I would argue that objective 1 should read, to ensure that the public waterfront area functions as a working port and provides for activities, etc., etc. And the second objective should read again, to ensure or to maintain the Oamaru Harbour Precinct as an attractive harbour area. Those are the objectives we see. So I would just, it's just slight rewording to indicate an intended purpose, not a statement of current status.
I believe that staff are comfortable with that change.
Yeah, I think we can redo that. I think also the gateway comment, we can probably just put as a gateway area, you know, from the south it is gateway area rather, because it.
Councillor Blackler?
I echo councillor Hopkins' comments, so nice to see those changes going in. Policy 1, number 6.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm reading the track changes, so that will be of no help to you. Policy 1, number 6, where it says the ecological values of the waterfront are maintained. I'd propose a slight change there. Ecological values of the waterfront are maintained and where possible enhanced.
Yep, happy to make that change.
Yeah.
There's merit in that,
Yes.
I think.
Well, it signals an intent.
Yes, indeed. Yes. And it is conditional.
No further comment on that chapter. I'm happy to move from the chair that is accepted, subject to the changes discussed. Someone wish to second that?
I think that's perfect.
I see councillor Percival nodding his head, so yes, thank you. So moved from the chair, seconded councillor Percival. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Carried. And I'd like to thank staff for the work that they put into the preparation for today. Thank the members for the work that they've put in. And declare the meeting closed at 11:25 AM.
Thanks, everyone.